So, there's a new talk by Roger Penrose. I was out camping, so anyway, he Penrose gave a presentation at the Tucson conferences on science of consciousness, and he is discussing his retrocausal quantum consciousness model, and the he ends the talk talking about the paradox of Hemingway, the author Ernest Hemingway, who I guess committed suicide. I don't know, but he calls it the Hemingway paradox of the firing the rifle, because based on Penrose's theory, when you do something that is splits a rapid trigger, which in this case it's a literal trigger, but he gives an example of like a professional tennis player or a professional pianist or any kind of extreme sports. The person is literally relying on a retrocausal, precognitive, quantum proto-consciousness in order to have that coordination of the body and the mind. They have to resonate their spirits, essentially their photons, their biophotons, with a superluminal signal that's quantum coherent. And so the question is that if that is their true consciousness, their proto-consciousness, before their rational thinking, then the decision to pull the trigger on the rifle or shot that, to commit suicide by Hemingway, it becomes a paradox, because if your true quantum consciousness is in the future, then how can you decide to pull a trigger when the actual speed of the trigger is also in the future? Now, Penrose's answer is that the quantum consciousness is delayed, and it stays delayed into the present. But it is the classical relativistic consciousness that is maintained as the hard reality, the hard truth, so to speak. And he said he had to think about this for a while. But Basil J. Hiley had a discussion or a claim to Penrose that there's no need to have this paradox of the collapse of the wave function by gravity or classical physics in quantum consciousness. Instead, you can have the noncommutativity that will self-amplify into the macro scale without any classical collapse and without any quantum wave function. It's just for Basil J. Hiley, using the Baker bracket or Jordan product, the classical physics then emerges as the limit of the Planck h-bar squared the reduced form of Planck's constant. Planck's constant divided by 2 pi squared, whole thing squared. But the thing is that technically you don't have to even, you can maintain the non-commutativity. And this was Eddie Ocean's point, is that for mind-body integration, what he called self-referential motion as Neigong or internal martial arts, then you can maintain the non-commutativity into the macro scale. And this is how you achieve anti-gravity as levitation. Sorry, I keep swallowing all the time because I just woke up and haven't had anything to drink yet. Okay, so and Anirban Bandiopahe recently, he also gave a talk at the same Science of Consciousness conference, and or I don't know if it was that conference or another one, but he posted on YouTube on how he's documented the super radiance in the tubulins and the microtubules of the photons. So you have this superluminal phonon signal, acoustic phonon signal between the photons. Now, B.G. Siddharth, another physicist in India, or Anirban Bandiopahe is from India. B.G. Siddharth, he emphasizes that the mass of the photon is actually from noncommutativity. And so again, that's from the momentum of the photon being directly proportional to the frequency as inverse to time. So the noncommutativity is in this retrocausal or superluminal time. Penrose uses the term retrocausal, which is from Cosa de Beauregard, based on relativity. But it's actually in pure time, so it's actually quantum and it's non-commutative, and that's what Basil J. Hiley's point is to Penrose. So Hiley tried to convince Penrose to adopt the non-commutative model. So what that means is that phase space emerges out of the non-commutative algebra of time and frequency. And then when you have this quantum phase space, then you end up having two positions for each particle. Now, Roger Penrose, he relies on Alain-Kahn. He cites Alain-Kahn for non-commutativity as the foundation of Penrose's palatial twister model of space-time. So Penrose doesn't go into the palatial twister model. He goes into the spinors, and the twisters are based on the Dirac spinor for Penrose's quantum retrocausal consciousness model. So it's definitely related. And then Penrose makes the point that gravitational entropy is the opposite of the entropy of matter. So Gerard de Hooft, in his article Light is Heavy, he points out that all of matter is actually made of photons. And so when we go back to the quantum consciousness argument of Penrose, he's saying that the classical physics is what remains in the end is the hard truth, even though the quantum consciousness will maintain coherence as a delayed reaction into the present from the future as a retrocausal signal in time. But if all of matter is made of light, fundamentally, then the noncommutativity through the time and frequency is also maintained in the macro scale through light. And this is the holographic model of reality based on noncommutativity. And so what that means is that what we, as in classical Western physics, what we think of as hard constant reality of matter is actually increasing the gravitational entropy on Earth. And so relativity as a science based on commutative geometry is actually causing the ecological crisis, whereas the true reality is what our ancestors called rainbow time in the Australian Aboriginal training based on the San Bushmen, our original human culture that left Africa and then went to Australia about 50 to 60,000 years ago. And that same group that went to Australia also went to the New World about maybe 22,000 years ago, over 20,000 years ago. Excuse me. Maybe if I clear my throat, I don't have to swallow as much. Okay, so this claim that all matter is actually made of light and that we live in this holographic reality, this is what Qigong master Chen Yulin agreed with. He read the book The Holographic Universe by Michael Talbot that was like a bestseller in the 90s, I think, when it came out. And so when Chen Yulin first came to the US in 94 and 95, he was buddies with a philosophy professor at the community college where Chen Yulin taught. And Chen Yulin, one of my friends, a good friend of mine from Venezuela, she meditated with Chen Yulin, with the philosophy professor, just the three of them meditating. And she told me about this, and then she told me about that before I met Chen Yulin, because then Chen Yulin gave a talk to my spiritual healing class at the University of Minnesota. And I already knew about him from my friend from Venezuela. And she happens to be indigenous. She was adopted out of indigenous culture when she was a baby, I suppose. I don't know. I never asked her what age she got adopted, but at any rate, she took me. I went to Venezuela with her and her son, and so that was a great experience. I got to go to the Andes, and I tried to do that as self-directed credit for the university, but that didn't work out. But I was spent about 2.5 weeks in Venezuela in the Andes. And I went to Caracas and all that. Anyway, so where was I? Okay, so when Chenny Lin said that the holographic model is real, that the holographic universe is accurate, then he was basically saying all matter is made of light. And he experiences that. So, for example, he can see inside your body. And he can also do that long distance, as long distance healing. And he is guided by this active information from the future, just as Penrose explains, and also is explained by the Bohmian quantum potential that Basil J. Hiley says is noncommutativity. And Eddie Oceans is saying that this Qigong Neigong training is noncommutativity. And this is what I figured out on my own. And that's how I discovered Eddie Oceans, because I realized if I figured this out, and I'm just an independent researcher, then somebody else must have figured it out. And so I kept searching and searching the internet, and it took me a long time to finally find Eddie Ocean's website on quantum psychology. And so he's arguing that the paradoxes in psychology, called double binds by Gregory Bateson, are explained by this non-commutative quantum logic of the imaginary number as primordial time. And Eddie Oceans collaborated with math professor Lou Kaufman. And so Lou Kaufman uses the equation, the non-commutative algebra of the equation I equals plus or minus -1 divided by I. And so Eddie Oceans uses that same equation to then explain the double bind paradoxes. So instead of having a circular process of symmetric time, you have a eternal asymmetric time shift. That is this primordial time or primitive time. And it's also retrocausal or superluminal. You can use either word. There's not really a word for it, for this, because retrocausal is assuming a classical model that Costa de Beauregard developed, where it's not technically a signal, but it's retrocausal in time based on relativity. Superluminal would be technically a signal, but you can have the signal since it's before it's technically energy. So these are, different terms in physics. Now, this primordial time logic of quantum psychology, Eddie Oceans said, well, it's based on inhibition as the ability to say no, to inhibit the prefrontal cortex. And if you're not able to say no and inhibit that prefrontal cortex for whatever reason, whether it's environmental or genetic, you can then develop various psychological paradoxes and so Eddie Oceans was saying, well, you could look for this in the using an MRI. If you could see the inability to say no, to inhibit in the neurons, then that would indicate the inability to have this asymmetric time shift from the future. And so this is the quantum consciousness model that Anirban Banyopahe is now corroborated, showing the super radiance as the quantum coherence in the microtubules and the tubulin being superluminal. And he's showing that this is limited to the microtubule. So that is the inhibition, is that it stops, that quantum coherence stops at the microtubule. Now, I posted a comment to Anirban Bandyopahe that the highest amplitude of the electrical conductance in the microtubule is at the microsecond wavelength, which is the ultrasound frequency. So I pointed out to Anirban Bandyopahe that the collagen of the body, which is the most common protein of the body, is piezoelectric at ultrasound. Hint, hint. And then I said, you can see my training manual for details. And so the training manual is in noncommutative macro scale quantum coherence of the mind and matter, just as Eddie Oceans realized, the secret of alchemy as internal martial arts, or qigong or neigong, is due to noncommutativity. And so I posted that comment last night for Nirban Bandyopahe. And I also sent him an email saying, because he is promoting this idea of the prime numbers being the secret of what he calls geometrical music, or so this geometrical music resonance using negative frequencies. He says it's not the same as Penrose, but it's based on prime numbers. So I sent him an email with Fields Medal math professor Alon Khan's latest lecture that was posted on YouTube, where Alon Khan says in the end of the lecture that randomness actually originates from prime numbers, and that the Riemann, he has solved the Riemann hypothesis, and the origin of the prime numbers is actually from this non-commutative time frequency that Alon Khan calls music of the spheres, or music of the shapes. That's it. That lecture title is a play on music of the spheres from Pythagoras, so music of shapes. And so this is, of course, the same music tuning secret that I had figured out as a teenager, that the truth of music is actually non-commutativity, and it's not the commutative geometry that originated from the wrong music theory of Philolaus and Archytas, and then promoted by Plato and picked up by Newton as gravity. And so this brings us all the way back to Penrose, that the relativistic gravity is actually originating from the non-commutativity, as Basil J. Hiley explains. And Penrose admits that he considers non-commutative mathematics to be a nuisance and that he's not very good at it. But at the same time, he also requires non-commutativity as the foundation of his palatial twister model. So, if Penrose studied Eddie Oceans and Basil J. Hiley a bit more, then he would understand that his retrocausal quantum consciousness model is actually non-commutativity. And so would Anirban Bandyopahe. And so Anirban Banyopai, then he went to my academia site to look at my training manual that I told him to look at out of Singapore. Or actually, no, I guess he's in Japan. So maybe that wasn't Anirban. He might have been in Singapore. I don't know. Maybe that was just a coincidence. So anyway, I will post the link to Basil, to Roger Penrose's latest talk and to Anirban Banyopai's latest talk. And of course, when we look at quantum biology, then Penrose's point is that the source of life as from negentropy or negative entropy is the real dark energy of the gravitational potential as the source of the sun. So this is what Schrodinger first claimed, how the fusion of the sun requires quantum entanglement that originates from negative entropy or negentropy. So this is also the proto-consciousness. So the proto-consciousness is also negentropy based on this secret non-commutative mass of the photon from the frequency and time. And as B.G. Siddharth explains, that the mass of the photon is due to the non-commutative space-time from the frequency as the momentum directly proportional to the momentum, with the time directly proportional to the wavelength. And that's directly from Louis de Broglie's law of phase harmony. So Professor Basil J. Hiley, he replied to me in an email, I don't know, maybe a couple years ago now, that he said that he does not believe in a symmetric rest frame of invariance. And John G. Williamson, who worked with Martin Vandermark,